What I want to give for you very plainly and very quickly is 3 or 4 principal ideas of what are the major tenets, philosophical tenets of postmodernism, and we will race through them. The first is this: they do not believe there is an objective reference for words. There is no reference for words of a language. So please listen to their own definition here very carefully. It is based on an epistemology that holds to a limitless instability of words, on an epistemology, a truth basis that holds to the limitless instability of words. Texts are stripped of their meaning and words are given no point of reference. There is a limitless instability in language. Words do not have a point of reference. You have your point of reference for language, I have my point of reference, and so the ground is always shifting in speech and in thought and in any form of propositional truth. Fascinatingly, Paul de Man, one of the spokespersons for trying to sustain this point, of all places he goes to Archie Bunker. For those of you in less than that generation, this was quite the show of all shows that broke all of the revered kinds of humor about 30 years ago. So Archie Bunker, what was his name? Carol O'Connor and Gene Stapleton, Archie Bunker and Edith Bunker. He was sort of the quintessential right-wing snob who bullied his wife and bullied everybody else and sneered at everyone else. And Edith was sort of that half-dumb wit, but was actually smarter than him. And so at one point he says to her, Edith, this is Paul de Man, by the way, giving this illustration. Edith, would you pack my bowling shoes into the bag? And so Edith says, Archie, would you like them laced from the top or from the bottom? And you can just see the expression. He says, Edith, what's the difference? And she goes into a prolonged answer on what muscles are held in place with the top lacing over against the underlacing, and the audience is roaring, and Archie Bunker is just staring at her, incredulous. Paul de Man says this proves, now brace yourself for this statement, here's what he says, this proves that rhetoric radically suspends logic and opens up vertiginous possibilities of referential aberration. What? That rhetoric radically suspends logic and opens up vertiginous possibility of referential aberration. What he's really saying is, it takes you to dizzying heights of meaninglessness. What Paul de Man does not understand is that the reason the audience was laughing was because Edith did not understand Archie's question. Archie was really saying, I couldn't care less. Do it at the top, do it at the bottom. She's going into this physiological impact of lacing shoes. But you know, they move from this horrible sense of superficiality to something that becomes extremely serious. And here's where I want to read for you this notation. Anthony Freeman, in his book, God in Us, A Case for Christian Humanism, talks about what the postmodernist actually means by language and how they make the charge. Listen carefully now. He is dealing with Isaiah 44, 14 to 17. He quotes the verse and then responds to it. Follow me carefully. The prophet Isaiah says, all who make idols are nothing, and the things they treasure are worthless. He cuts down cedars, with some of it he takes and warms himself, and he kindles a fire and bakes bread. But he also fashions a god and worships it. He then prays to it and says, save me, you are my God. So he takes the tree, cuts it down, makes an idol, worships that idol. In the end, it's something that he has fabricated with his own hands. Anthony Freeman says, that's what the prophet Isaiah says. But listen to what Freeman goes on to add. He says this, the writer, who is Isaiah, failed to realize how close his own case was to that of the pagan whom he was lampooning. The idol worshiper had constructed his own idol with wood, had constructed his idol with wood. The author made his God out of words. That really was the only difference. Do you see it? Isaiah talks about the idolater who takes wood and then proceeds with that wood to make an idol, and proceeds with that idol to then bow down and worship it. Freeman says, you know what Isaiah doesn't realize? He's made his own idol with language and then fabricating this idea of God, and he's bowing down and worshiping before his own language. That's what this is all about. The limitless instability of words. That words actually do not have an ultimate point of reference. And what happens at the end is that we manufacture reality by the words we use. Listen to how Nietzsche said it. The real truth about objective truth is that the latter is just a fiction. Every candidate for truth must first be expressed in language, and language is notoriously unable to get us to reality. Words, like a hall of mirrors, reflect only each other, and in the end point back to the condition of their users without having established anything about the way things really are. Truth is the name, says Nietzsche, we give to that which agrees with our own instinctive preferences. It is what we call our interpretation of the world, especially when we want to foist it upon others. It's like a hall of mirrors, smoke and mirrors, as it were. We're just using words. They reflect back, they bounce back. It only really reveals what we want to term as truth. But ironically, a few stanzas later, here's what he says. But I still am too pious that even I worship at the altar where God's name is truth. What Nietzsche is saying is, yes, it's all about words, but let me tell you something. At the end of the day, I too believe there's some such thing as truth, because I cannot deny truth at the same time believing that my denial is not truthful. You know, there was an old Irish farmer, and the Irish have a way of saying things. It is something like this. The story goes, a tourist is driving around, and he gets lost way out in some hinterland in parts of Ireland there. And he looks at a farmer and he says, can you tell me how to get to such and such a place? And the farmer stops and says to him, if that's where you are going, this is not where I would begin. If postmodernism wants to end up with autonomy, this is not where to begin. But this is where they begin. They basically end up cutting the branch on which they are sitting. They are talking about the limitless instability of words, but they use words and words and words and words and words, telling us that their philosophy is actually quite stable because they are explaining it so thoroughly. So the first point is basically there is no point of reference for words. Secondly, there are no laws of logic which we should be seeing as superintending or governing our discourse. No indubitable laws of logic. The laws of logic are cerebral. They are sort of ways in which we construct our own Western world or Eastern world. There are actually no laws of logic that are undeniable. Now, the truth of the matter is, ladies and gentlemen, when you go to the laws of logic, there are fundamentally four. There are many subsets under these, but fundamentally there are four. One is the law of identity. When you have identified something as A, you're not talking about non-A. The second is the law of non-contradiction. The third is the law of the excluded middle, which basically means just because two things have one thing in common does not mean that they have everything in common. And fourth is the law of rational inference. The law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, the law of the excluded middle, and the law of rational inference. These are the four fundamental laws of logic which we assume or are subsumed in our discourse. But the postmodern thinkers logically want to argue that logic doesn't really work. They want to debunk this notion of logic. What fascinates me, absolutely fascinates me, when I became a Christian in the 60s, and I would start visiting campuses and so on, they would ask me for reasons why I have become a Christian. And I remember struggling sometimes to answer their questions. And so I made it a pursuit of my life to study the relevant answers to such honest questioners. Now when you give the same answers, do you know what they say to you? This thing's too rational. There's too much of logic involved in all of this. The moment they've been beaten at their own game, they want to change the rules and the terms of engagement. This is precisely what's happened in our university campuses. The law of non-contradiction is being jettisoned and denied. When I finished a talk at the University of Iowa, a student ran to the microphone, she cupped her hands and shouted out at me. William Lane Craig and I were doing some open forums out there together. The place was packed. And she looked at me and shouted out, "Who ever told you that our answers to life needed to be coherent?" Where did you get this from? Is this not another Western way of foisting its worldview upon others? And she went on and on. One of the secrets to answering a question is let the questioner talk long enough and they will convict themselves. And so when she finished, I said, "Ma'am, I'll be glad to answer your question. I just have one question for you. When I answer you now, do you want my answer to be coherent or may my answer be incoherent?" And the audience roared, and I said, "You know what?" I said, "Hold that laughter." I said, "I really want to know where she's coming from. Is she comfortable with contradiction only in herself? Or is she comfortable in contradiction with any counter-perspectives as well?" You may have heard this, so forgive me for repeating it if it's familiar too, but this happened years ago, and then I'll move to my next couple of points. It was in Santa Barbara, California. It was in the 1980s or so. And I was dealing with a series of talks on why I believe Jesus Christ to be the only way to God. And a professor of philosophy, an American gentleman, came up to the front and said to me, "I want you to do me a favor. I want you to deal with the subject why you're not a Hindu," he said. He said, "Because I have become a Hindu." I said, "Well, I'd be interested in hearing why you have," and so on and so forth. I said, "This is fascinating." He said, No, you don't need to hear that. I want to hear from you why you're not one." I said, "You want me to take a whole talk on that?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "No, I don't want to do that." I said, "You know, I learned a long time ago when you throw mud at others, not only do you lose a lot of ground, but you also get your hands dirty." He didn't find that funny. He just looked at it, looked at me, and he said, "No, I want to take you on." He said, "You know what? I'll challenge you. You speak on why you're not a follower of that worldview. I'll bring my whole class on philosophy, and we'll rip you apart at the end of it." I said, "That's supposed to be an inviting feeling for me?" I said, "Look, I'll make a deal with you. Let's go out for lunch." And I gave him my famous line, "You pay, I'll pray, and we'll have a good time together." I said, "I don't want to impress your students. I don't want you to impress anybody else. It's just you and me." He said, "Can I bring the professor of psychology with me?" I've always wondered why he wanted to do that. Whether we were going to be two subjects under scrutiny or study or what. I said, "I'm happy for you to bring him, but you and I are going to talk, not him. Just you and I." He said, "Okay." So we went out for lunch, and he began his long discourse with his opening line, which was flawed. He began by saying to me, "There are two kinds of logic." Actually, there are many more, but you don't stop a person that quickly. So I said, "Keep going." And he said, "There are two kinds of logic." And he said, "Ravi, the kinds of logic are these. One is the law of non-contradiction, the either-or system of logic. If an affirmation is made, an assertion is made, you say it is either this or that, not both of these." And he gave several illustrations on this. He said the problem with that either-or non-contradictory type of logical system is that it's a Western way of thinking. I said, "No, it's not." He said, "Yes, it is." I said, "No, it's not." He said, "Yes, it is." I said, "No, it's not." He said, "Yes, it is." I said, "Keep moving on then." He said there is a second kind of logic, that is the dialectical system of logic, both this and that. He said if you look at a systematic treatment of Eastern philosophy, you ask one person, "Is God personal?" He says yes. You ask the other person, "Is God personal?" He says no. You ask a third person who's right, he'll say both of them. He says because the Easterner does not worry about contradiction. It's the dialectical system of Hegel and Marx and on and on. And he went and he said, the dialectical both hand is an Eastern way of thinking. I said, "No, it isn't." He said, "Yes, it is." I said, "No, it's not." He said, "Yes, it is." I said, "No, it isn't." He said, "Yes, it is." I said, "Move on." So it established these two propositions. The either-or system of the law of non-contradiction is a Western way of thinking. The both-and dialectical system is an Eastern way of thinking. He drew his conclusion now. What you really need to do, Ravi, when you're studying Eastern philosophies, rather than saying that you've dismissed it because of systemic contradiction, is to say, but this is the way we think in the East, so it's okay. You should not worry about contradiction. They don't. He said, your problem is you're studying the Eastern religion as a Westerner. The irony of this conversation was this was a Westerner telling me that. I said, okay. I said, sir, I just have one question for you. Because by now he'd used up all of his placemats and everything. And he'd drawn on everything. We'd finished our lunch, the psychologist and I. His was sitting congealed in front of him. So I said, I just have one question for you. What you're telling me, sir, is that when I'm studying Eastern philosophy, I either use the both-and system of logic or nothing else. Is that right? That I either use the both-and system or nothing else. Is that right? He just picked up his knife and fork. He put it down. And God is my witness. Here's what he says to me. The either-or does seem to emerge, doesn't it? I said, sir, I've got some shocking news for you. Even in India, we look both ways before we cross the street. It is either the bus or me, not both of us. I said, and you've got your facts wrong. Shankara, the leading proponent of monism, of the Hindu kind, was an either-or believer. He believed in the law of non-contradiction. Gautama Buddha was born a Hindu. He rejected Hinduism and became and founded Buddhism because he subscribed to the law of non-contradiction. Muhammad very clearly subscribed to the law of non-contradiction. The question is whether those systems are true or not, standing up to their own tests by their own leading protagonists. I said, you know what? You spent the last hour using the law of non-contradiction with which to debunk it. You were telling me either I use your system or nothing else. When I told my brother-in-law this, who's a Hindu convert, he said to me, he said, that's funny. He said, you're an evangelist, I'm an expositor. You go for the jugular, I go for the defense. He said, if he'd said that to me, I would have said, if both hand is all that you crack it up to be, why can't I use both the both hand and the either or? It's a kinder, gentler version of what I've just said to you. But when you look at postmodernity, no ontic referent for language, no objective place for logic. Thirdly, you move very quickly. There are no boundaries for meaning. An overarching story. So they debunk words, they debunk logic, they debunk meaning, and they debunk the meta-narrative. There is no overarching story. You know, I was born and raised in India. And some time ago, my wife began to do a family tree study of my own life. She talked to one of my aunts who'd lived to be 103. My wife comes from Canada. And she said, I want to know a little bit about Ravi's background and family. And page after page was written and written and written, and then I sent one to all of my brothers and sisters. We could only get back about 7 generations. How wonderful it is to know your own background, your own family tree, from whence you came. Think about being in this world and knowing nothing about its origin, knowing nothing about why you're here, knowing nothing about language, knowing nothing about meaning, knowing nothing about the story of why this world is meant to be. There's no meta-narrative. There's no overarching story. And ladies and gentlemen, von Schlegel years ago wrote a play about an audience sitting in an arena, in an auditorium, looking at a platform, waiting and waiting. The curtain rises. All of a sudden, all they see is the backs of people sitting on chairs facing the other side. And 5 minutes later, another curtain rises. And those on the stage are looking at another stage with other people sitting on their chairs and watching the backs of them waiting for another curtain to rise. After about 20 minutes of this, the people in the actual auditorium start looking around to see if they too are on a stage. There's no point of reference whether you're author or spectator. You know, the tragedy, as I said, is genius gone wrong. Let me close with a couple of thoughts for you here. And with that, I will come to an end. Well, Sam, will you tell me the parable of the Good Samaritan? This is a young ordinand about to get his first interview. Yes, sir, I will, sir. Gladly I will. Once there was this man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among thorns, and the thorns sprang up and choked him. And as he went on his way, he didn't have no money. And there he met the Queen of Sheba. And she gave him 1,000 talents and 100 changes of raiment. And he got into a chariot and drove furiously. And when he was driving under a big juniper tree, his hair got caught on the limb of that tree. And he hung there many days, and the ravens brought him food to eat and water to drink. And he ate 5,000 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. One night when he was hanging there asleep, his wife Delilah come along and cut off his hair. And he dropped and fell on stony ground. But he got up and went on, and it began to rain. And it rained and rained 40 days and 40 nights. And he hid himself in a cave, and he lived on locusts and wild honey. Then he went on till he met a servant who said, "Come take supper at my house." And he made excuse and said, "No, I won't. I have married a wife and can't go." And the servant went on into the highways and in the hedges and compelled him to come in. After supper, he went on and came down there to Jericho. And when he got there, he looked up and saw that old Queen Jezebel sitting down way up high in a window. And she laughed at him, and he said, "Throw her down out there." And they threw her down, and he said, "Throw her down again." And they threw her down 70 times 7. And of the fragments that remained, they picked up 12 basketsfuls, besides women and children. And they said, "Blessed are the peacemakers," P-I-E-C-E. Now, whose wife do you think she will be on that judgment day? It's a brilliant story, but it's not the story of the Good Samaritan. He didn't get the job. Do you know the story of the gospel? Tell me the story of Jesus. Write on my heart every word. Tell me that story so simple, sweetest that ever was heard. Tell how the angels, heaven, sang as they welcomed his word. Tell me the story of Jesus. Write on my heart every word. She says, whisper it in my ear till I can see his love. Fanny Crosby, a blind woman. There's a story to be told. There's a story that's messed up, and geniuses are leading our world astray. Take to the word, take to his reason, find his meaning, and tell his story well. There are many who are waiting to hear good news. Postmodernism was bad news. God bless you. Thank you very much.